Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. In the domain of customs, manners, and everyday living, the Jacobean era set a distinct tone in Jamestown, Virginia. Let's examine the archaeological remnants of daily life during the early years of the colony, along with the BBC.
The archaeological site at Jamestown contains a wealth of 16th and 17th century objects. The assemblage is kaleidoscopic. Tobacco leaves and terracotta smoking pipes, animal bones, maize and blueberry seeds, a quartz crystal arrowhead, a gentleman's signet ring. It's a unique archive of the early years of English settlement in Virginia. Established in 1607, the plantation was so closely tied to the world of courtiers and merchants that one traveller referred to it as the London colony. The mix of artifacts here is fascinating and a bit jarring. One doesn't expect to see an ancient Roman lamp in the humid climate of the Chesapeake, but it seems to have been brought there as part of a colonist's cabinet of curiosities, nestled a stone's throw from where a sinewy cottonmouth snake has been sunning itself at the edge of the marsh. Among all these goods, I'm drawn to an object that might not seem particularly thrilling at first glance. It's a clunky iron rod, eroded from centuries in the soil. But it's a goffering iron, the tool used to shape the ruffs worn by wealthy English men and women in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. Archaeologists have found no fewer than 5 such irons at Jamestown. Ruffs have become powerful visuals in the way we think about Elizabethans and their adventures in the world. Those lace collars cartwheel around some of the most famous faces of Shakespeare's England. Dainty as meringues, these pert accessories appear in costume dramas, stage productions, and almost all portraits of the time. By the 1580s, Elizabeth I's ruffs were so oversized that her head seemed disconnected, floating in a cloud of white lace. So why did peak Elizabethan fashion end up in colonial Virginia? Why, when colonists were starving to death, did people care about linen and lace? Tracing these ruffs in visual art, museum collections, and archaeology can tell us a good deal about the expressions of power that these ruffs intended to convey, and about the layers of memories and associations that might be contained in an item of clothing. Ruffs at the intersection of fashion and colonialism also invite us to look beyond the sense of romance and daring that suffuses the image of Renaissance explorers. Ruffs were worn by well-off English men and women from around the mid-16th century, and we find them all over the place. In the portraits of monarchs and advisors, in satirical engravings and woodcuts, in poems, inventories, and surviving clothing of the time. Incarnations of the detachable collar are among us today, in shops and in the runway shows. White collars frame our faces and make us stand out. Puritans who denounced oversized ruffs in the 1580s and 90s often associated the accessory with vanity and waste, with women transgressively taking up space. In 1583, Philip Stubbs complained that women arrived late to church because they took too long getting dressed for the occasion. "If she turns her face," Stubbs wrote, "her whole body turneth, else the ruff is bruised." King James I was notoriously disturbed by sartorial extravagance and female independence. Sermons addressed to the king and court in Whitehall included one that praised James for bringing reform to women whose prostituted beauty walks with ruffling yellow. One churchman compared women to a merchant ship. A world of wonders it is to see a woman so deformed with a ruff like a sail. Ruffs, and the starch used to stiffen them into place, became a flashpoint for court scandal in the mid-1610s when the businesswoman Anne Turner became implicated in the murder of Sir Thomas Overbury. Overbury was a courtier who opposed the marriage of the king's favourite, Robert Kerr, to Lady Frances Howard. During her trial, Anne Turner was accused of smuggling poison to the imprisoned Overbury in a selection of tarts and jellies, leading to his death soon after. Turner had a lucrative monopoly on the saffron starch that tinted ruffs yellow. When condemning her to be hanged in November 1615, Chief Justice Edward Coke ordered Turner to be executed in her yellow starched ruffs and cuff bands, drawing associations between her economic agency and transgressive interference in high politics. Even when ruffs weren't associated with murder and suspicion, Tudor and Stuart monarchs regularly sought to regulate their subjects' sartorial flair. In 1611, apprentice laws in Guildhall maintained that any apprentice who wore a ruff band could not have it exceed 3 yards in length before it be gathered. Also, that no apprentice shall wear any piccadilly or other support in, with, or about the collar of his doublet, but the collar to be made close and comely. Ongoing legislation around ruffs in London indicate how these strips of cloth were used to discuss broader socioeconomic and political concerns. Every stitch, decoration, trimming, and even depth of a ruff could come under scrutiny and convey minute messages about rank and status. And then we find those goffering irons in the colony, dating from a time when Jamestown's gentlemen were criticised for expecting stately houses, costly apparel, and banquets in the fledgling English settlements. The character of the presumptuous, newly arrived gentleman in Virginia persevered well into the later 17th century. But as the goffering irons suggest, elite gentlemen didn't just bring all those associations about status and power with them from England. They wanted to ensure they were visibly maintained. In the portraits of explorers from Francis Drake to Walter Raleigh, sitters fashioned themselves with iron and lace. Swords and armour glinting in the light, the lace of finely stitched ruffs and embroidered collars showing a fusion of the martial ethos and high courtly civility. In 1608, the aristocrat George Percy asked his brother to send him starch used to stiffen the linen of his ruffs, shortly before the outbreak of what has become known as the First Anglo-Powhatan War. In the extremity of hunger during the winters that followed, the soldier colonist John Smith recalled, "Those that had starch for their ruffs made a gluey porridge of it." The earliest known inventory of a gentleman's estate in English America belongs to George Thorpe, drawn in 1624. By the time of his death, Thorpe's once opulent wardrobe had become somewhat shabby. The secretary who documented the goods listed an old black silk suit and some breeches, quite out of fashion. Among his velvet cloak and silver cups, Thorpe had also held on to 33 falling bands or collars, portable objects that were important for how a gentleman sought to replicate English civil society, transposed onto indigenous homelands. But the life of the ruff doesn't end there. We can continue to trace it to another place, the writings and artworks of indigenous authors and artists today who associate ruffs with very different cultural memories. Here, ruffs herald a mournful story, representing the rupture caused by settler colonialism and forced assimilation. Think, for example, of the only known image of the Algonquin woman, Pocahontas, completed in her lifetime, a 1616 portrait by the engraver Simon Van de Pas. Pocahontas, a name that means laughing and joyous one, was the daughter of a powerful ruler, known by the English as Powhatan. Colonists first encountered her as a young girl who accompanied other Algonquins in their diplomatic visit to James Fort. By the time she sits for this engraving in London, nearly a decade later, a very different person appears before us. A series of events had served to sever her from her native culture, including her kidnapping and her marriage to the planter John Rolfe. Pocahontas is depicted in high Jacobean fashion, including a drop earring, tall hat, and, yes, prominent lace ruff. This image conveys majesty, but it suppresses something too. The presence of a ruff means Pocahontas cannot adopt important elements of her own people's dress, such as Roanoke bead adornment. John Smith, who wrote about Pocahontas in his General History of Virginia, boasted that she had been made civil after our English manner. In the Micmac artist Gail Tremblay's 1998 installation, Reflections on Pocahontas, Pocahontas is shown as a sexualized Barbie doll, then in a coffin, trapped in Jacobean clothes with a large ruff encircling her neck. An accompanying audio recording in the installation reads, "The tragedy of Pocahontas's assimilation to British ways is a great romance. She was eroticized in the imagination. Our native cultures, a magic show doomed to feed other people's fantasies." Gerald Visner's 1991 novel, The Heirs of Columbus, is a retelling of the Columbus story from an Indigenous perspective. The novel contains a vivacious trickster-poacher character named Philippa Flowers, who spends much of the book on a quest to repatriate Pocahontas's remains. Her search for Pocahontas brings Philippa to London, where she is invited to a recreation of the court masque that Pocahontas herself attended. Her host orders Philippa an outfit made of brocaded red velvet with an elaborate white lace collar, based on an original engraving by Simon van de Pas. Philippa refuses to wear this, wanting to keep her braided hair and blue moccasins. Later, in Gravesend, she sees another portrayal of Pocahontas in rigid court costume with a wide lace collar. In Visner's novel, the assimilation of Pocahontas is bound up in a colonial story that she has not yet been released from. Memories of the white lace collar follow a haunted Philippa around as she searches for the actual physical remains of the woman who died in the heart of an emerging empire. Through Philippa's eyes, the Jacobean court becomes alien and absurd. It is not a dazzling place, but a feverish nightmare. Pocahontas was a curiosity, Philippa realizes, as the colors and silks of the mask swirl around her. Bound in the court costumes of the 17th century, the garments alone would have burdened the health of a tribal woman. And so the perception shifts. There should be no Ruffs in the Chesapeake, 3,000 miles from the English court. Even within the colonial logic of the fledgling colony, Ruffs are not practical or necessary objects. But this does not make them unimportant. They are an item of decorative excess related to the assertion of political authority. The menace that Philippa Flowers detects under the surface of court frivolities invites us to consider how what we wear around our necks, beads, ruffs, chains, braces, pendants, scarves, ties, can elevate or suppress our sense of self and condition our ability to move freely through the world.
Check out the YouTube version of this episode, which has accompanying images. I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.